So this evening we're going to learn about Cholent. This is the hot food that everybody has on Shabbos. And the question, of course, is what's the origin? How important is it? Why do we do it? How is it that almost all Jewish communities, at least the ones living within proximity, like Ashkenazi communities or Sephardic communities, ended up doing basically almost exactly the same thing? And the interesting thing is that there's enormous commonality, as you'll find out, between the Sephardic Cholent, called Adafina or Sichna, and the Ashkenazic Cholent, called Cholent. Okay, so our journey is going to begin in the 12th century with the commentary of the Zerua, the Baal HaMaor. So the Baal HaMaor is a commentary on the rulings of Rabbeinu Alphus, and he's born towards the end of the 12th century into the 13th century. And he has a long commentary on the third chapter of the Sechet Shabbat, which deals with the notion of food being left on the fire for Shabbat or taken off the fire and so on and so forth. It's called Perekira. So I want to read to you from the end of his opening commentary. He speaks in great detail about how one may or may not do this and the logic behind it. And then he says, Takonas Rabbeinu, it is ordained by our rabbis, la'aneg es ha-Shabbat b'chamen, to delight in the Shabbat with hot food. And then he says, v'chol mi she'eino ochel chamen, anybody who doesn't eat hot food on Shabbat, tzorech bedika achrov, we have to check, im hu min, maybe he's a heretic. Ve'emesk, and if that person were to die, yisasku b'amamen, he doesn't really need a Jewish burial. You don't need Cholent, you're not Jewish. That's what he says. Ula hazmin, ula vashel, ula hatmin, ula aneges haShabbos. So a person has to, he says, prepare and cook. And he uses an interesting word here, which is found in the Gemara multiple times, to be matmin, to hide away or squirrel away, to enjoy the Shabbos. And he says that the person who does this, hu hamaymin, he's the believer. V'zeicha leketz hayamin, he merits the arrival of Mashiach, or ketz hayamin, according to the Gemara Masechet Sanhedrin, is a reference to the resurrection. So those are very strong words. We know in the Gemara that one is permitted to have hot food on Shabbos. Here, the Baal HaMaor is telling us that if a person doesn't have hot food on Shabbos, then this is a sign of a major breakdown in that person's Jewishness. Now, the words of the Baal HaMaor filter through in halacha, not in the Bet Yosef, but they do find themselves in the actual Shulchan Aruch. And in the Shulchan Aruch, it's found in the words of the Ramah at the end of chapter 257 in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch tells us, mitzvah, it is a mitzvah, lahatmin l'Shabbos. Once again, we use the word hatmana. Hatmana means really to hide away, to squirrel away, to put away in a hot place for Shabbos, kedei sheyochel chamin, so that you might eat hot food on Shabbat. Ki zeh michvod ve'oneg Shabbat. This is included in the notion of honoring the Shabbat and delighting in Shabbat. V'chol mi she'eino ma'amin b'divrei chachamim, anybody who doesn't believe in the words of our sages, v'oiser achilas chamen, and he prohibits the eating of hot food b'Shabbat, chashinon shema minhu. We think that this person might be a heretic. We don't know if he's really Jewish. Now, this seems like, on the surface, it seems like you must eat hot food on Shabbat. It's not an option. You have to eat cholent, no matter what. And if you don't eat cholent, you're missing a chunk of your neshama. So the Magen Avraham comes along and he says, if it's difficult for somebody to eat the hot food, then he's allowed to eat cold food. You don't have to eat hot food. It's more like you should eat hot food because that's how people usually have a good meal. But if it happens to be difficult for you to eat hot food, then you don't actually have to eat hot food. Now the Alter Rebbe kind of sews this all together, and there's really like a word or two here where you see how and why he sews it together. The Alter Rebbe finishes off the chapter 257 in the Shulchan Aruch by saying, mitzvah lahatmel Shabbat. It's a mitzvah to put food away to keep it hot for Shabbat, which is exactly the verbiage of the Ramah. And he says the reason it's a mitzvah lahatmin, it's not a point of making something hot, and then you have a hot cholent, and it's a hot cholent. And who eats it? Nobody, but it's hot. That's not the point. The point is you should hide it away, kidei sheyochel, so that you might eat the chamin b'Shabbos. Why? Kizehu michvaid v'oinig Shabbos, because eating the hot food is a way to honor. It's a way for us to dignify and delight in the Shabbat. Abo misha chamin mazikin loy, but a person for whom eating these hot foods could be dangerous, could actually harm him, muter le'lechol tzeinon, he's permitted to eat cold foods. So the Alter Rebbe incorporates both the words of the Ramah as well as the words in the Magen Avram in a single sentence. And therefore he adds a word here. He says, Aval, but, Misha einim maimim b'divrei chachamim. If you're not eating cholent because you don't like cholent, that's fine. But somebody who doesn't believe in the words of the chachamim, v'oiser achilas chamin b'Shabbos, that person proscribes the eating of hot food on Shabbos. The Alter Rebbe uses slightly different verbiage. He says, Choshesh shema apikoresu. We think maybe he's a heretic. So what's behind this all? Why is it that it's so important to eat hot food on Shabbos? Well, not so important. If you don't like it, you don't have to eat it. Or if you're not well, you don't have to eat it. But if you don't eat it because you don't believe in hot food, then we have an issue. So in order to understand the background of the Baal HaMaor, which filters down into the Ramah and all the way into the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, I want to share with you what's written in Sefer HaItim. Sefer HaItim is a contemporary of the Baal HaMaor. He lived a little bit later, maybe 2 or 3 decades later. And that was written by a great sage whose name was Rabbi Yehuda bar Barzilai. We believe he lived in Provence, southern France. And he gives us background to understand where the Baal HaMaor was coming from when he wrote such sharp words, which is really interesting because the Gemara doesn't say anything like this. And none of the other Rishonim say this. The Baal HaMaor is the only one who goes to war over Cholent. But the Baal HaMaor's words are not forgotten. The Baal HaMaor's words are preserved for posterity in the Shulchan Aruch by the Ramah, augmented by the Magen Avram, and then the Alter Rebbe puts it together. This is the halacha. And it's really important to eat hot food on Shabbos, unless it hurts you. But if you're not eating the hot food on Shabbos because you don't want to eat the hot food, because you don't think it's the right thing to do, then maybe you're an apikeres. So the Sefer HaItim says it is known that during the enormous disputation between a renegade group of Jews who are known as the Karaites, or in Hebrew the Karaim. Today there are about like 200 of them left. But at one time in the Middle East there were more Karaim than there were religious Jews. At one time they were like some of the pseudo movements, judo movements today, Judaic movements, which are in violation of halacha, all of which incidentally are sinking and their numbers are shrinking, and the only ones who have numbers growing is because most of those who are considered part of the numbers are actually not halachically Jewish. But this is an old problem that we've had, a recurring issue that we have. Torah Judaism always seems to be under attack. Jewish people go away, they create their own movements. Invariably, those movements crumble, they disappear, and Torah Jews are still at it. So the Karaites, they learnt the verse in the Torah that says, Lo tevaru eish b'chol moshvotechem. This is in the 35th chapter of the book of Exodus. It says, don't have fire incinerating in your dwellings. They said, that means literally, no fire on Shabbat. And so they would make sure that all the fires were extinguished prior to Shabbat, and they would sit in the dark, and they would eat cold food, and that's the way they observe Shabbat. And they certainly would not allow anybody to put something away in an oven so that it could be eaten on the day of Shabbat. From the Karaite, non-halachic, non-Torah Shabbat Peh perspective, according to the way they looked at things, that was an absolute violation of the Torah. And they didn't believe in the words of the sages. They didn't believe in the idea of the oral traditions that were passed down. And this, says the Sefer HaItim, is why it became so important during the early Middle Ages. Just in the 11th and 12th century, it became so important to make sure that in every Jewish community, people were eating hot food on Shabbos. Because this argument became the crux of a dispute between the non-halachic Jews and the halachic Jews. The Jews who followed Torah, the written Torah and the oral Torah, and those who rejected it. And that's why Tiknu Rabbeinu, that's why our sages instituted that if you want to honor the Shabbat properly, you must honor it with hot food. Now, this has to be understood. If they wanted to make a point of what is halachically permitted or not permitted, okay, that's fine. But here we're emphasizing this is how you honor the Shabbat. So the Sefer Eitim says, look, when you have a meal during the week, a cold meal is a cold meal, but a real meal is a hot meal. You know, like the schools that want to get kids to come, hot lunches. That's a real meal. Tuna fish sandwich is not a meal. That's a snack. It works when you don't have a real meal, but a normal meal is a home-cooked hot meal. So the idea of a hot meal is the way people typically enjoy food. Food is served hot, unless you're serving ice cream. So if food is served hot, then Shabbat, we learned that it's important for us to delight and honor the Shabbat with food. And since food is a major staple in the honoring of Shabbat, and since normally food is eaten hot, so he said it's only logical that this would be something that's required. In order for us to be able to properly honor the Shabbat, what would we have to do? We'd have to make sure that there's hot food. Especially because the Karaites said you're not allowed to eat hot food on Shabbos. And they actually violated the Shabbos in its spirit entirely because they didn't enjoy Shabbos. Shabbos was a miserable day, a day when they were cold and dark and hungry. Exact opposite of Shabbos. And therefore the Sefer Eitim says that the Cholent was the Meichel Choviv, was something which is extremely cherished by Jewish people, and that was left not for Friday night, but specifically left for the next morning, for Shabbat morning, Shabbat early afternoon. Of course, you can only leave the soup on the fire for so long. At a certain point, the soup will evaporate. You won't have any soup left. But the cholent, that can be slow cooking. You have beans and barley and other things. You have meat or chicken in there. And then you can leave it on the fire and it can simmer for a very long time. The Gemara in Masechet Pesachim on page 105 tells us that the honoring Shabbat with food is not primarily Friday night, but even more important during the day. And therefore, he says, it's extremely relevant and meaningful for us to distance ourselves from the twisted and perverted ways of the Karaites, and instead to follow the way that our sages ordained. Elsewhere, the Sefer Eitim writes, Hatmonas chamen, the idea of squirreling things away, hiding them away, so that they might remain hot for Shabbos, is takono gedoyla. This is a great injunction. The tikinu rabbanon mishum einik Shabbos, that our sages established for the principle, for the ideal of honoring the Shabbat, because all of the days of the week, that's the way a person would eat. That would be considered a good meal. Especially on Shabbat, the meal should have warmth, and the meal should be hot, and the meal should be delicious. And therefore, it's very important that with this, Ba'ika B'hai Milsa Oinik Shabbos, this is an actual expression of Onik Shabbat. And Sefer Eitim emphasizes a second time in a different chapter, and he says this was the injunction of the Chachamim to honor the Shabbat, but equally important to combat the Karaites. And in some way, the Cholent represents the victory of Torah Judaism. Because if the Karaites were victorious, we would be sitting in the dark. If that would be the Jews that were left behind. So the Cholent represents Shabbos' victory. It represents the victory of Torah Judaism, of Torah Shebechtav and Torah Shebal Peh. And that helps us appreciate and understand why the Cholent is such an important food. Let me share with you some of the words that were penned by the Mishnah Brura. He says on this Ramah, he comments on this Ramah at the end of chapter 257. He says, Ubiyamenu, and in our days, which I suppose will return to the last century, he says, Ba'avenuseinu harabim, in our unfortunate sinful situation, there's a kilkul gadol, there's a tremendous weakening of Yiddishkeit, he says, with many people who are not putting the cholent on the fire for Shabbos. He says, this is a terrible thing. And in the end, he says, they end up violating the Shabbat because of it, because people want hot food and they think it's permissible to tell a non-Jew to put it on the fire for them. And he said it's a terrible thing. And he finishes off and he says, V'chol bal nefesh, anybody who considers himself to be a soulful individual, lo yasser miminag Yisrael, he shall not depart from the custom of the Jewish people, lahat min chamen shal Shabbos, to literally hide away the hot food of Shabbos, to fulfill the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos, kasher nohagu avotenu me'olam, as our ancestors have always had the custom from time immemorial. And then he goes ahead and he quotes the Baal HaMoyer that we began today's class with. So it's interesting. There's a contemporary of the Mishnah Berurah, actually died 10 years earlier, but he was a Hungarian Rav, and he wrote a sefer called Lekutei Mahariach. His name was Avram Chaim Friedman. And he writes the following, he says, you know that all of the Shabbat foods, which are customary amongst the Jewish people, he says there's meaning and purpose behind them. And he uses an interesting phrase. He says, Yesodasam, their foundation, their root is Baharei Kodesh, in the holy mountains. And he says, from the words of the Baal HaMoyer you can see. And he says, it's true, the Baal HaMoyer, he doesn't talk about Karaites. The Baal HaMoyer talks about Oneg Shabbat. That's all he talks about. He says, but if there wasn't something behind eating hot food on Shabbos, if there wasn't a sod, some kind of secret, some kind of kavana, he would not use such strong words, he would not make such a tumult. So the Lekutei Mahariach is felt very certain that there had to be some kind of Cholent secret. There's something more than meets the eye. And presumably the Lekutei Mahariach saw the Sefer HaItim, and since he doesn't quote necessarily the Sefer HaItim, he gives a very logical reason. This is the victory against the Karaites. This is showing that Torah Judaism reigns supreme, and that the Chachamim's words, the words of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which are passed, of course, from Moshe Rabbeinu to Sinai, are binding and eternal. So he seems to think there's some other secret that's attached to it. What might this be? So I want to suggest two very interesting things that I want to share with you. The first is about the verbiage that's used for Cholent. Of course, we know Cholent is left on the fire from Friday afternoon. You have to cook it so that it's already edible before the Shabbat, and you leave it on the fire. We cover the fire with a blech, as it's called, so that the fire isn't actually visible. The reason we do this is that a person shouldn't come to adjust the fire. Once upon a time, you literally took a poker and adjusted the fire. In today's day and age, you would do it with the knobs, but when you can't see the fire, you know to forget about it. You don't kind of poke around, stir the pot. The pot is off limits. When you're ready to eat it, that's when you take it off. And the halacha is ideally that a cholent has to be cooked, edible before Shabbat, but it's something that can steep and continue to cook and get better and better. That's how you make cholent. The crock pot that's very famous was actually created by a Jewish, I think it was a dentist, and he did it to honor his mother, because his mother wanted to have Shabbos. She wanted to have a cholent, and she had a hard time with the stove and the blech, so he created a silo, a very, very elementary kind of silo. The first crock pot was very simple, with a pot that would be lowered, a ceramic pot lowered inside, and it's surrounded by heat, and it's able to cook. It's able to simmer. You don't have to leave the fire on, you have the oven on, and it works for cholent. Incidentally, if you do use a crock pot, you have to lift just a little bit, because it's an issue of something called hatmana, which is a halachic thing that I'm not even going to know. Just pointing that out. At any rate, so with regard to the concept of eating chamen on Shabbos, so the terminology that's used is hatmana. The word hatmana means to hide or to entome, to squirrel away, to hide away so that we can't get to it. Because if the fire was open and you could get to it, that's a problem. Then you might adjust the flame. So there's a sefer called Ader Bar Morim where he suggests the following notion. And maybe this is one of the secrets of cholent, as we will see. So first, let's give you some background here. Okay, we're going to introduce two verses to you. There's a verse which is found in the 64th chapter of the prophecies of Isaiah. And it says, and I'll quote, the third verse says, Ayin lo ra'ata, no eye has seen it, Elokim zulatcha, only God. Yaseh lemachakelo, he will wait for he who waits for him. He will do for he who anticipates or waits for him. So here's an excerpt of the words of Rashi. Rashi quotes the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat on page 63, and he says, Kol haneviim kulam, all of the prophets, lo nitnavu, did not prophesize, ella liyamot HaMashiach. Inasmuch as many of those prophecies are not exactly pellucid and clear to us, but their prophecies were all about the days of Mashiach. Aval olam haba, but to the future, which if you remember, the Baal HaMoyer uses that very future. Olam haba is the world, olam hatchia, the world of the resurrection. That's the Ketz HaYamin that the Baal HaMoyer references. So he says, the olam haba, it says, ayin lo rata, no eye has seen this. Mashma, says Rashi, this indicates Ein shum novi. No prophet's eye ever saw that. What Hashem will do l'mechakeloi to those who await for him. Zulati eincha atar lekim, with the exception of your eyes, says Isaiah, you God. Okay, so we have this idea that the ultimate delight, the cosmic Shabbat, the perfect reality that we're all waiting for, that you're mechaka, that we're anticipating and waiting for, that perfect reality is something which ayin lo rata, no eye is able to see. Only God, no prophet was ever able to see this. So he suggests, the Adam Avarim suggests, he says, okay, ayin lo rata means you're not able to see it. He says, what happens when you hide something away? It's not visible. The Cholent, by hiding it away, he says nobody can see the Cholent until the Cholent is ready. And he seems to think or suggest that there is a link between the idea of hatmana, hiding away, and the nature of the fullest unfolding of the cosmic Shabbat, which is ayin lo rata. Okay, just like a cute verbal link. And he also suggests that there is a pasuk, a verse in the book of Yoel, the prophecies of Joel, in the second chapter. Yoel, the prophet, says, Tiku shofar b'tzion. A shofar should be sounded in Zion. And what will happen when that's sounded? V'hariyu bahar kochi, it'll reverberate, it'll trumpet out on my holy mountain. And then yirgezu kol yesh v'ha'aretz, all of those who dwell in the land will tremble. Kiva yoyim Hashem, ki karev, that will know that the day of Hashem's day is just here. And of course this refers to the proverbial sound of the shofar that will herald the coming of Mashiach. And Rashi says that the reason that this shofar will sound is sheyashivu b'tshuva, that they should do tshuva before the day of Hashem arrives. And the Radak puts it, tam tiku, the reason for this business of tiku is la'oirer halavavis al hatshuva. So it's interesting to note that the words tiku, shofar, betzion, if you take the Hebrew words shin, bet, and taf, it actually spells Shabbat. It actually spells Shabbat. And of course, tshuva is also linked to the concept of Shabbat. So in other words, we're alluding to some kind of secret here. This is the secret of Shabbat, which nobody sees. The Cholent represents some kind of secret element of Shabbat. It's the message that's broadcast. Where's the Cholent? The Cholent's put away. The Cholent is... It's there. You have to wait for it. Everybody waits for the Cholent. So the Cholent becomes, in some way, like a paradigm of something which represents what we're waiting for, what's hidden away, the future, what we'll have through the coming of Mashiach. Okay, so I thought that was interesting. But I think what I'm going to share with you now is actually really compelling. And we're going to look first to a Gemara in Masechet Chagiga. The Gemara in Masechet Chagiga talks to us about the shulchan, about the golden table. And the golden table, of course, was piled high with the showbreads. And the question there is, if the golden table could become ritually impure or it can't become ritually impure, is it considered to be a large piece of furniture that nobody ever moves or not? And anyway, who would make it impure? And the Gemara talks about taking it out to show Oli Regel, those who came to the Beis HaMikdash for the holiday, to show them the shulchan. And then the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says that the reason that this would be done is they would take the shulchan, Magbiya Neisei, they would lift up the shulchan. Umarim boy, they would show this table, take it out from inside the Heichal, the sanctuary building where nobody could see it, and they would show Oli Regel, they would show the people who had come to visit the Beis HaMikdash. They would bring it all the way down outside into the Ezrat Kohanim, and then down into the Ezrat Yisrael, which is the front of the courtyard, down the stairs on the lower level, lower platform of the courtyard. And they would show them Lechem Apanim, they would show them the showbread. This is on page 26, side B of Masechet Chagiga. V'omrim lehem, they used to tell them, Ru'u chibatchem lefnei hamakom. See how much Hashem cherishes you. Meaning He appreciates what you do for Him, and so He makes a miracle happen. What does Hashem do? Siluko kisiduro. When you take off the lechem upon Him, the 12 showbreads, which were done on Shabbat afternoon, at the changing of the guard, after the Shachrit services were over, at the time of when Musaf additional korban was brought, that's when the new Kohanim, new group would come in, and there would be a changing of the guard. The changing of the guard would take place at the Shulchan, where Kohanim would come and holding these giant breads. Kohanim would stand on the other side, and they would move the bread on, and the other Kohanim would take the bread off, and the Shulchan was never bereft, never empty of bread, because the new breads were placed on Shabbat afternoon, and the old bread was taken off, and it was eaten for the Shabbat meal by the Kohanim. So he says, Siluko kisiduro. What does this mean? Shesiluke, Rashi says, l'Shabbat haba. It's placed on Shabbat. It's removed on the next Shabbat. And when that happens, it's cham. It's hot. Ki yom siduro, just like the day it was placed. And the Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi, the Gemara says, as Shua ben Levi says, Nes gadol nase belechem aponim. An amazing miracle happened with the lechem aponim, namely that ki siduro kach siluko. The way it was placed, that's the way it was removed. Hot, fresh bread was placed, and a week later, hot, fresh bread was removed. So it's a miracle. So the Tosfos asks a question. The Tosfos says, 1 second. Really? It was hot when they removed it, like when they placed it? How was it hot when they placed it? The Tosfos says, we have a Gemara in Menachos on page 95, side B, that says that the lechem aponim were baked Erev Shabbat. So it was baked Erev Shabbat, and this is taking place Shabbat afternoon. Even if it was baked right before Shabbat, bread doesn't stay warm forever. So how could it still be warm? It actually doesn't make sense that it would still be warm. It's impossible, says the Tosfos, that it should still be warm. Unless we say, according to that opinion, nishar betanor, they left it in the oven, lishmar chomo, so it stayed from Friday evening, all Friday night, in order to maintain its heat, ad hashabbat baboker, until Shabbat the next morning. In other words, the first thing ever that was left overnight until the next day, so that it would be hot on Shabbat, was the lechem aponim, the showbread. Now, if you leave bread in the oven all night long, you're not going to have bread in the morning. Maybe you'll have matzah mel. You won't have bread. But it seems, the Tosfos seems to say, they were able to leave this bread in the oven, and it would be taken out of the oven on Shabbat afternoon, and it would be hot. That's exactly when we eat cholent. We would take it out of the oven like the lechem aponim. And now it gets even more interesting. Because this business of the lechem aponim and the hot food and so on and so forth, so here we have a very, very interesting story which shows up in the book of Leviticus. The Jewish people are finally getting their act together. We're going to be heading to Israel soon, and they're supposed to observe the Shabbat. Comes the first Shabbat in the 24th chapter of Leviticus, and it's Parshas Emor, and the Torah tells us in the 10th chapter, in the 24th chapter, the verses before speak about the concept of Shabbat, and it speaks about the showbread. In verse 8 it says, B'yom HaShabbat, each and every Shabbat, Yaruchenu, you'll arrange these breads, L'fnei Hashem Tamid, Me'et B'nei Yisrael, Brit Olam, these are the breads that the Jewish people bring for God. This is an eternal covenant, and it will be for Aaron and his children. They will eat this bread, and it's a chakola. Okay, so it talks about the bread that was brought, piled high on the table. It was a gift from the Jewish people, an offering to God, eaten by the Kohanim. The very next verse says, Vayetze ben ish Yisraelis, an Israelite man went out. V'hu ben ish Mitzri, he was fathered by an Egyptian. He goes betoch b'nei Yisrael, amongst the Jewish people. Vayinotzu b'machana, and he curses in the camp. There was a dispute in the camp between Bena Yisraelis v'Isha Yisraelis. This one who was a Jew who's descended from Jews, and this one who came from an Egyptian paternity. And so they end up going to court, and he loses. He said he wanted to be part of this tribe, and they said, no, you're not part of this tribe, dude. Tribal things go according to the father. You're Jewish, your mother's Jewish, but you're not part of this tribe. He loses the court case, he walks out, and Vayikalel, he curses the name of God. It's a terrible sin. And they bring it to Moses to say what to do. So the question is, it says, Vayetze ben ish Yisrael. He went out. Where did he go out from? So let me read to you what the Vayikra Rabbah says. The Medrash Rabbah says like this. Where did he go out from? Reb Rachya taught me Parsha Shel Mailon. He went out of the Parsha we just finished reading. What did we just finish talking about? We talked about the concept of lechem aponim. And over there it says, V'lakachta solet, you'll take fine flour and you'll bake it. And what did he say? He blasphemed. His blasphemy was, Darkei shel melech liyos oichel pas chama. He says the way of a king, of a sovereign, is to eat fresh bread. And here, this lechem aponim is cold bread. He said lechem aponim could be 9 days old. And he said if it was Yom Tov on Erev Shabbat, it could be 10 days old. If it was 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, it could be 11 days old. So he was mocking the lechem hapanim. In other words, the way that he cursed God was by mocking the notion that the bread, the showbread, was old bread. And he said, this makes no sense. Your whole worship of God, you're placing bread. If you want to bring homage or honor to God, you bring fresh bread every day. Who brings God? The week-old bread? And then the Kohen have to eat week-old bread? So the way that he blasphemed, the way that he expressed his being an apikoros, a heretic, and the way he mocked God, was by talking about the lechem hapanim. This was the way that he made fun of Hashem. This is the way he made fun of the Torah. So our rabbis say, there's like a connection here. So the lechem hapanim was like a cholent. It was kept hot all the way until Shabbat morning. It's hidden away. Lechem hapanim in the oven, taken out right before Shabbat afternoon. Hot bread was brought and placed on the table. This fellow, who blasphemes or disregards God, in what way? By laughing at the concept of the lechem hapanim. And so they draw this link or this line between the concept of the lechem hapanim, or the hot bread, and the notion of the hot cholent. Where did the Karaites lay their stake? Where did they stake out the ground? Where did they say, this is how we demonstrate we do not believe in the oral Torah and the teaching of the rabbis? Where did they lay claim to? Their issue, their claim was with regard to the concept of the cholent. So you see, there's this link. It's always been this way. The idea of the bread which was hot for Shabbat, or the cholent which is hot on Shabbat, the idea of that which is left over, and then just like that showbread was miraculously hot on Shabbat, so there's some kind of connection between the two. And here we can see that cholent became the showdown between Jews who believed in Torah Shebaal Peh and Jews who didn't believe in Torah Shebaal Peh. Either you believe in the oral tradition, or you took the scripture at face value and you didn't accept the concept of halacha Moshe Sinai, all of the oral traditions that were given from God to Moshe Rabbeinu at Mount Sinai. So these are two suggestions of maybe something deeper that the cholent alludes to. This I could tell you. Here's two very interesting stories. One I'm reading about, and the other one I actually heard about from the person who heard it from the Baal HaMaisa himself. So the Baal HaMaisa here is my wife's grandfather. His name was Beryl Grossbaum. And Rabbi Beryl Grossbaum, my father-in-law's father, was a young man in the 20s. And for a time, it seems he was running the kitchen for the previous Rebbe. So once he brought, and this I'm reading in print, that he brought the previous Rebbe, he brought in the cholent, he filled a plate of cholent, and the Frierdiker Rebbe ate the whole plate. So he thought, oh wow, he must really like my cholent. So he went and he filled up another plate of cholent. And he ate the whole next plate of cholent. And afterwards, the Frierdiker Rebbe said something to him like, it was not good for me to eat 2 plates of cholent, but I don't want to leave over a Shabbos cholent. So do me a favor, please. Next time, don't pile up my plate so high. If it's on my plate, I'm going to eat it. In other words, the respect that the Frierdiker Rebbe had for the concept of cholent. And the story that I heard from my father-in-law, heard it from his father, was that during the Sheva Brachas of the Frierdiker Rebbe's third daughter, who was murdered in Treblinka with her husband, Rebbe Shena, she married her cousin, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Harnstein, a Cohen. And at the Sheva Brachas, the Shabbos Sheva Brachas, which was like in a resort area, he was in charge of the kitchen. And he hid the cholent so well that nobody else knew where the cholent was. And he was a man who used to daven for many, many hours. His whole life, even when he was much older and he didn't really know what was going on around him, he was davening for many, many, many hours. Hours and hours a day. In fact, the first Friday night after I got engaged, we went to Feigi's grandparents to say good Shabbos, and it was very late on Friday evening. But he was still middle of Shachris. A whole day he was davening Shachris. And he was living in a different world. But this was a person, the one thing that his mind remained sharp about was his davening. So on that particular Shabbat, he was davening, what Chassidim call davening ba'avoda. And the Frierdiker Rebbe finished davening, and everybody went, and they washed, and they had a meal in the Sheva Brachas, and nobody could find the cholent. He was matman the cholent so well, nobody knew what the cholent was. So they benched, they did Birchat HaMazon, and they're getting ready to leave, and suddenly he came running in, and he felt terrible. He said, "Oi, I brought the cholent." Frierdiker Rebbe said, "Oh, you brought the cholent?" He said, "You have to go wash again." And he washed a second time, and he said, "A Shabbos dike cholent, varf minishtaris." You don't throw out a Shabbos cholent. So clearly, there's a special chavivus, there's a special love that the Rabbeim had for this concept. It's a serious business, this concept of Cholent. In fact, the Rebbe Rashab once said in the name of the Alter Rebbe that there's a Kabbalah, he said, that goes back all the way to Moshe Rabbeinu. That the order of Shabbos is first Cholent, then Kugel, and then your meat. So people ask the question, does a Cholent have to have meat in it? The answer would be, it would seem not. It doesn't have to have meat. You can eat the meat later. The point of the Cholent is it should be a tasty Cholent. And tasty Cholent usually has meat in it. But that's not the point. The point was not, we don't have the Cholent in order to eat meat. We have the Cholent in order to eat hot food. And even in the event that somebody doesn't like Cholent, in which case he's not obligated to eat Cholent, the Torah observant Jew must make a point of having something hot on Shabbat. Be it a coffee or a tea, you have to have something hot on Shabbat. Some of that meal has to be hot, it has to be warm, because this is how we show the honor of Shabbat, and this is how we demonstrate our belief in the concept of Torah Shabbat Peh. And I'll finish with this. Okay, so Cholent is really important, and it has all this background, and it's a real, it's a part of Judaism. Now, just about every Cholent I've ever seen has in it potatoes. Okay, 'cause that's what in Europe they had a lot of potatoes. What else does Cholent always have in it? Every Cholent, beans. Always has beans. Always has beans, and usually kidney beans. In the Sephardic lands, they into chickpeas, rice. Rice takes the place of barley. The barley or potatoes in the Sephardic lands was rice. Again, that was a basic staple. That's a prevalent staple, an affordable staple. But we always had, in addition to the foundation, be it rice or barley or potatoes, there was always beans. In the Sephardic lands, it was chickpeas. In the Ashkenazi land, kidney beans. So you say, okay, so what? Well, listen to this. Listen to this. The Maharil was the forerunner of the certainly Ashkenazic Shulchan Aruch Minhagim. In the end of the Sefer Maharil, he has something called Likutim, just like random collection of different halachas. So in Likutim Yutes, in the 19th entry, he says like this: Minig Estreich, it was the custom in Austria. The Chol Yom She'ein Oimrim B'Tchina, any day which is considered joyous, so we would omit the penitent part of davening. Ein regilin lechel b'mini kitnius. Then no legumes or beans were eaten. Why not? So because dumya la'avelis, the damya, because this is like mourning. Hamegalgol ba'olam ke'elo shehem megulgon. That the mourning represents death or represents the way the world turns. It's a circle of life. And because it's a circle of life and beans are round, they turn. So if it's a happy day, no beans. No legumes, no beans. And he says, V'chein haminig betfutzes Rhinus, in the Rhine, the Rhine area, also the same custom holds sway. So Austria and Germany, they had this custom. They did not eat legumes or beans on happy days. What is the origin of this? Well, the origin of this goes back to an extremely ancient story. One of the earliest stories in the Torah. It's in the beginning of Parsha Toldot, and this is the aftermath of the passing of Avraham Avinu. Avraham dies, Yitzchak is sitting Shiva, and Yaakov is making the Shiva meal, the Sudas Havara. What's he cooking? A lentil soup, kidney beans. And he's cooking these kidney beans, and Esav walks in. And Esav is exhausted. But he's not exhausted because he worked hard. He's exhausted because he just committed his first homicide. He just killed Nimrod because he liked Nimrod's clothes, because Nimrod had these fancy hunting clothes, and he wanted to get those clothes. So Esav steals the clothes after he kills Nimrod, and he's a little overwhelmed because he just committed his first homicide. And he walks in and he finds Yaakov, and he says, what are you cooking? Yaakov's like, soup. It was like Zadie's funeral earlier today. He says, yeah, give me some soup. And Yaakov says, no, you're not getting some soup. That's not happening. He says, I need soup. I'll die if I don't get some soup. Yaakov says, fine, let's negotiate. You give me the firstborn rights, I'll give you the soup. Esau says, no problem, fine. And then it says, Vayitain, this is in the 25th chapter of Genesis, verse 34, V'Yaakov natan le'Esav, Yaakov gives him lechem, bread, unezid adashim, a bowl of lentils. Esav eats and drinks, gets up, and he scorns the firstborn. Okay, so why lentils? Why does Torah even tell us about the menu? We don't know much about many menus. We know what Avraham Avinu served to his guest, and that teaches us a lesson about how you engage in hospitality. Avraham Avinu didn't eat milk and meat together, but Avraham Avinu didn't know what his guests would like. So he prepared them buttermilk, and he prepared them bread, and he prepared them fresh meat. We're demonstrating Avraham Avinu's largest, Avraham Avinu's code of hospitality. That's where we get the menu there. We know that Lot earlier was serving matzah. Avraham was serving matzah. Okay, that gives us this inkling that they observed Jewish things even before the Torah was given. Okay, but here we are, and we're getting the details on the Shiva meal. Why? Why are we getting a menu for it? So the Bereishis Rabbah says that the reason that he was cooking these lentils or beans is because Adasha zu asuya kegalgal, because this lentil or kidney bean is round. And kacha olam asa kegalgal, so also the globe is round. So much for those who think that the rabbis thought the world was flat. Many other people thought the world was flat, but we never thought that. And here's proof. Here's a medrash that was written more than 2,000 years ago. And then he says, so that's the world goes round, people live, people die, circle of life. And then the medrash says, ma adasha zu ein lo peh, it has no opening, it's a circle, so there's no beginning or end, it's a circle. Af avil, a person who's mourning, ein lo peh, he has no mouth, he's not able to open his mouth is sealed. And that's why when a person is first sitting Shiva, in the beginning he doesn't talk. Shell-shocked, overwhelmed, nothing to say, no words. And then the Medrash says something very interesting. Ma adasha zu yeshba evel v'yeshba simcha. This adasha, this lentil, has sadness attributed or attached to it, and also has joy attached to it. So kach evel shel Avram Avinu, the mourning of Avram had also a joy attached to it. And the joy was shenatal Yaakov es habechora, that Yaakov Avinu, Father Jacob, took the firstborn. Okay, so here we have it. The very first Shiva meal in the world was beans, lentils. Okay, so the Maharil says that's why it became the custom in the lands of Ashkenaz that on happy days, on days when we don't say Tachnun, we don't eat beans. Because we don't want to mar the day, which is supposed to be joyous, with beans that bring to mind mourning. That's a Shiva meal. Now, what else is usually served at a Shiva meal? Think about this, eggs. Eggs are always served at a Shiva meal. In the Sephardic Cholent, what always ends up in Adafina or Sichna or Sichnit? Eggs. Why? I don't know. That's the custom. All the Sephardim have the same custom. They put this egg in the cholent, and then they peel the egg on Shabbos, and of course the shell is porous, and a brown egg comes out. So a white egg goes in, a brown egg comes out, and the egg, you can cook and cook and cook. It just gets harder and harder, and it doesn't suffer from sitting on the fire for all that time. So we find in the cholent something which is used for mourning. The egg is used for mourning, and the egg is in the Sephardic cholent. The beans are used for mourning, or they used to be used for mourning, and they're always in the cholent. All cholents have beans. In fact, you can buy today in the store a bag of cholent beans. They even call it cholent beans today. And here we have this open halacha, or minhag from the Maharil, where the Maharil says that on a day we don't say Tachnun, forget about Shabbat, a day we don't say Tachnun, Maharil says, then we don't eat beans, because it brings to mind sadness. Unless you think, okay, fine, it's a minhag in the Likutim of Maharil from the 15th century, fine. Well, it actually shows up in Shulchan Aruch. It shows up in Shulchan Aruch, where we have the words of the Magen Avram in his commentary on which days we don't say Tachnun. And he says we don't say Tachnun on the 15th day of Av, we don't say Tachnun on the 15th day of Shvat, and not on Rosh Chodesh, and not on Chanukah. And then he says, Magen Avram says, quoting the Maharil, B'nei Estraich noigim shein eichlin kitnius b'yamim shein neiflin. We don't eat beans on days we don't say Tachnun. The domi la'avelut hamid galgel. Because it's like avelut, which goes round. All of our cholents are messed up. How did this happen? How did they put morning food into the cholent, which is supposed to be the greatest celebration, the secret of Shabbos? We have lechem hapanim. We have the showbreads represented on our table when we have these 12 showbreads, and we have a challah which is woven of 6 strands of challah and 6 strands of challah, and then you put the 2 challahs together, you have 12 strands of dough, which factually speaking, it's all just one loaf of bread. But we made this intricate weaving of strands of dough so that we might represent the lechem hapanim, and then the heat of the lechem hapanim, which is a great meal, as Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said. This miracle that they would show was a publicized miracle. They would show them the lechem hapanim, and they could see that the bread was hot. They didn't have to touch it. They saw. That's how hot it was. A week later, they could see the bread was hot. And that this miracle, as the Gemara in Masechet Chagiga tells us, was look how much Hashem loves you. Look how much He cherishes your offering. He kept it miraculously warm all this time. And we're commemorating that amazing miracle of God showing His love for us every single Shabbat by hiding away the cholent and eating hot cholent on Shabbos. So this is the big Shabbos food. This is Shabbat's signature dish. It's like, it seems to fly in the face of the code of Jewish law, which says, we're not supposed to have beans because they remind us of mourning. So very interesting. I did find one of the commentaries actually who talks about this. The back of the Shulchan Aruch, they printed here like a collection of different commentaries. And he prints from a sefer called Kerem Shlomo. And he says that we have the Maharil's ruling that in Austria the custom was not to eat beans on such a day. And he says, Ruba da Alma, most people, Ochin Kitnias b'Shabbos. They're eating beans on Shabbos. And incidentally, a lot of people have a custom of eating chickpeas on Shabbos also, even Ashkenazim. Not in the Cholent maybe, but they eat chickpeas. It's also legumes, beans. V'hu l'chayda neged min hakanal. The Kerem Shlomo says, this is a direct contradiction to that halacha. So he says, U'b'sefer Tosfos Shabbos, in a book called Tosfos Shabbos, he writes, Shemotza, that he found in a sefer called Shiyarei Knesses Hagdola, Shenoigen lechel beitzim b'Shabbos b'Shachris, that it's customary to eat eggs on Shabbos morning. Now, in the Sephardic community, it's in the Cholent. In the Ashkenazi community, many have a custom of eating chopped eggs as part of the Shabbat meal. And some they have it, certain communities in the Polish communities, they call it Eier Mitzibel. They take an onion, and they chop it up, and they have chopped up onion and eggs. It's like a big religion. You have to eat Eier Mitzibel. You have to eat onion and eggs on Shabbos morning. Some chop it up with chopped liver. It's like a big deal. You have to eat this Shabbos morning. And why is this? He says this is Mepnei Evlei Shel Moshe Rabbeinu, because this reminds us that our great eternal teacher Moshe Rabbeinu was taken from us on a Shabbat. Shemeis b'Shabbat. Umitam za'oichlin gam hakitnius. So the Cholent actually has within it a reminder of the morning of Moshe Rabbeinu. We remember Moshe Rabbeinu every Shabbos. Now Moshe Rabbeinu and Shabbos have a very special relationship, because when the Jewish people were slaves in Egypt, it says Moshe Rabbeinu came up with this idea. Of course, he knew it's Shabbat and he wanted the Jews to keep Shabbat, but he said to the Pharaoh, if you want your slaves to be productive, if you gave them a day off, they'd be more productive. You get more done in 6 days. If you gave them a day off on the 7th day, then you have them working continuously, because people just get burned out. And he actually convinced the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh thought, okay, great, I'll get more productivity. I'll get into work even harder. I'll have higher quotas. So he gave them Shabbat off. And that's why we say in the Shabbat morning prayers, Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko, in the gift of his portion. Moshe Rabbeinu had a personal affinity for Shabbos. It was his thing. Of course, Matan Torah is on Shabbos. And incidentally, when we made the golden calf, we lost all these special lights that 1,000 lights that Hashem gave us, and the 2 crowns that Hashem gave us, and it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu. Some say it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu on Shabbos, some say it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu. That's why his face shone. But it says Moshe Rabbeinu gives it to us every single Shabbos. The Chli Yakar says he gives it to us every Shabbos. And that's what we call the Neshama Yeseda. That's called the extra soul, which, by the way, Rashi says, an extra soul, you can enjoy the food more. You have koyach to eat more. So at any rate, we see that there's this concept of mourning, which kind of punctuates the Shabbos. So yes, it's true. This is food of mourning, but nonetheless, that food of mourning doesn't make us sad, but it does make us remind Moshe Rabbeinu. And it's very interesting that in the language of the Medrash, it says the Adasha has Evel and has Simcha. So some want to connect it. You see, it has Evel and Simcha. The Adashim, the lentils, represent the joy of Shabbat, but at the same time also the memory that we lost Moshe Rabbeinu. And this business of Eivel and Simcha there were actually three great tzaddikim who were saviors for our people who all passed on Shabbat. And they are Moshe, Yosef, and David. And some maintain, it says in a sefer called Divrei Tzaddikim, that's why there's ayer, tzibul, and legumes. The onions, the eggs, that's the onion egg salad, and then the beans and the cholent. All of these things are eaten for a Shiva meal, and he says this reminds us of the great tzaddikim. It actually is customary not to say Good Shabbos after Mincha on Shabbos because David HaMelech passed away at Shasa Mincha in the afternoon. So we see there is an element of remembering these great tzaddikim in as much as Shabbat is a day of joy, but it's out of honoring these tzaddikim and the loss of these tzaddikim. It's not actual mourning. We're not allowed to mourn on Shabbos, chas v'shalom. We have to be joyous on Shabbos. But nonetheless, the fact remains that we have this halacha. On the other hand, we have the legumes, we have the beans. I want to finish off with a few interesting little points. The mayor of Pri Mishlam said that you should know, he said, that especially the beans, they make up the essence of the cholent, he says, and you should know that every cholent has a malach with it. There's a special malach who was assigned to the cholents of the Jewish people, and everybody knows, the cholent did turn out well, the cholent didn't turn out well. There's an element of mazel in every cholent. There's no guarantee. Sometimes the cholent is, they say in Yiddish, gelungen, and sometimes not. Rabbi Yisrael of Ruzhin, the great holy Ruzhin Rebbe, he said that we know on Rosh Hashanah we don't blow the shofar if it falls in Shabbat. And he says, do you know why? And look, it sounds like a joke, but Yisrael Ruzhin was not a joker. He said that there's a malach whose job is to take care of the shofar and the Shabbos food. That's his job. And he says that malach, if you look at the names of the malachim that we mentioned before the Tkiyas Shofar, one of the names of the malachim is spelled Taf Shin Beis Shin. So the holy Ruzhin said that Taf Shin Beis Shin stands for Shabbos and the Shin stands for shofar. And we know the malachim could do one thing at a time. So when it's Shabbos, he's busy with the cholent. So that's why you have no shofar being blown. When in Rosh Hashanah is on a weekday, the malach is not busy with the cholent, so instead the malach is busy with or has time, so to speak, for Shabbos. And this is an amazing story told with the Tzemach Tzedek and the Mordechai Chernobyler. They had this discussion about the concept of the kasha cholent, the cholent made with buckwheat, and they said extraordinary things about the kasha cholent, that sometimes even a great Torah genius with all his hard work on Torah, more could be accomplished by eating kasha cholent even than through the emphasis on Torah study and so on and so forth. But really, in view of everything we learned tonight, we understand how the cholent has become the signature dish of Shabbos, a basic staple of Shabbos. It represents our emunas chachamim, our faith in the sages and in the oral tradition of Torah. And ultimately it has come to represent the joy of Shabbat and is filled with not only good taste, but an enormous amount of symbolism. And that's the Cholent story.